Good morning, everyone, and a massive welcome to AXA Coral Live and to this Caring for Coral live lesson. It's really wonderful to have you all with us. We've got classes from across the UK and US, and it's great to be talking about this topic, looking at the future of coral. And we've got some shout outs for you. We have Year 8 with Mrs. Rawlings at Collington Grammar School in East Devon. Hi everyone there, and a big welcome to Norton College students and their 9D class. Now, we are broadcasting live from the Kamabi Research Station, and that is on the island of Curacao in the southern Caribbean, just off the coast of Venezuela. The Kamabi Research Station is a fantastic home from home for scientists from around the world, where they have access to accommodation near to the wonderful reef environment and also access to research facilities. Now, research stations are great because it's that combination of being near the environment that scientists are studying and then having access to the microscopes, labs, mini aquaria, and all those different facilities that assist scientists in understanding the reef better. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Renee to Coral Live, and we're going to be speaking to you together for this live lesson all about caring for coral. Renee, we've got fantastic classes, and we're going to be talking through, I think, really sort of like what we can all do to help the coral reef and the coral animal have a great future.
Great to be here again.
Thank you so much. And Renee, we're going to come to your research and what you've been doing in just a bit. But to start off with, we've got a couple of videos that we've shot just on the reef around Curacao. And we're gonna sort of like, I think first of all we're gonna show a video of a healthy reef, and then one that's not doing quite so well, and see how the students feel about that. For students who are, when you're watching this video, we've got a student sheet. If you're using it, it's got some notes on it, and it's just sort of noting down how you feel about the videos that you're going to see. So just an emotional response. So there's different ways that you can note down your emotions. First of all, there is the student sheet. We've also got a poll, a question online, so you can use the polling app to send in your thoughts. And then lastly, you can always just write those up on the board next to the video. So when we're showing the healthy reef, typical healthy reef around here, and we can sort of talk through what you might typically see on a healthy reef. So let's roll that. Renee, when you're on the sort of, the wonderful sort of like the elk horn and everything else, what are the kinds of things that you would normally see there?
In terms of animals, I suppose.
Animals and just yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reef is a very rich environment, obviously. It's quite unlike many of the environments you see on land, for probably the most important reason that it is more open, if you like. When you walk into a forest, there's a lot of trees surrounding you, and your vision will be limited by the amount of trees and green that you see. Whereas on a reef, the substrate is usually relatively lowish, and you have a great vision across. And therefore, you tend to see a lot more animals, such as fish, turtles, moray eels, that swim around because the vision is quite long. So it seems at first sight that there's a lot more life than many terrestrial environments, and that's just in the water column. And then when you look close down, you've obviously got the corals, you've got the algae, you've got the sponges, you've got all the little critters that reside in the framework, the crabs, the shrimp, all these kind of things. So altogether, it's a very colorful and abundant ecosystem that as I said, will almost always show you something new every time you look at it.
And I know that we've got students who are making their notes and their comments in their classes watching this video. Just as they're coming to the end of that, Renee, what is it like for you? And it may have changed over time from the first time you dived on a healthy reef to now. But when you're in the water on a healthy reef, what are the kind of emotional words that sort of come to mind?
I'll take it back to the first time I saw it, because now obviously I work there a bit more and it's become a bit more normal for me. But I would say the first time I've been on a reef and actually realized that I was there and looked at it sort of in amazement almost, really. I would probably use the word awe, because it's not just beautiful, but it's also a bit awe-inspiring. It really grasps you in a way that I've only found very few other natural systems do. Maybe best to compare it when you're at the edge of a canyon and it sort of takes your breath away a little bit. I think that's probably the best way to describe it for the first time.
Brilliant. Renee, thanks so much. And just in a bit, we'll receive through here some of the responses that the students have been giving. I think we're now going to have a look at a section of reef near here that's perhaps not doing so well. And when we're going to have this video playing, and I think for me some of the obvious differences are, strangely, you expect fish to be everywhere in the ocean, but it seems sort of rather lifeless without too many fish around. Yeah. And when there's a sort of I don't want to call it slimy, but it's like a fuzz going on. What's that fuzz all about?
Well, so there, like I said, there's perhaps I should quickly reel back a little bit and to say that there's not just one kind of coral reef. There's many different varieties depending on where you go in the world. But when I said, when I was talking about the coral reef in general, I meant to say that there is sort of an overarching theme or an overarching feature, perhaps is a better word. When you look at a coral reef, doesn't matter where you look at it in the Caribbean or in the Pacific Ocean, that they all have in common, which is that they are dominated by corals, obviously, hence the name. And as I mentioned, there's not just corals on a coral reef, but there's other things such as algae, microbes playing a very important role. Now, you don't see those normally, but when coral reefs tend to start to decline, what we really mean mostly is that the corals itself are doing worse. But that naturally means that a lot of other organisms will do better, and they will take over the role and the sort of environment that was once occupied by corals. And that's the sort of slimy stuff that you talk about, Jamie, which usually consists of, mostly algae. They tend to grow a bit fuzzy and slimy over the top of things. There could be various forms of bacteria that make these mats have the same appearance. Other things that could become abundant, at least temporarily, is decomposing matter. So organisms that have recently died and are then being sort of broken down by microbes. And that all contributes to what you indeed call the sort of more slimy, fuzzy appearance of a reef.
And when you see a section of reef like that, is that also normalized for you now, or do you get a sense? I mean, how does that make you feel?
We see it more and more, so I've become more used to it. But I don't want to make it seem that I am used to it. Yeah. It hurts, obviously. It makes me upset, makes me disappointed. But at the same time, as you say, it is becoming a reality in some parts of the world, in some parts more than in others. And therefore, as a scientist, you have to study these parts as well, and you come across them, and sometimes we even go out and look for them, to look for the worst bits we can find so that we can work on them and study them and perhaps tell why they're doing so bad. So it's becoming a more familiar sight altogether, yes.
And Renee, you used a word there which sort of struck me, which is disappointed. Is that in yourself, in people, I mean, it's a quite strong
Yes.
word to use.
No, absolutely. It's a general disappointment, I would say. I've never really connected it to one person or one group of people in particular. But yeah, of course, it's disappointment in the fact that here is such a nice system that is doing so poorly. I know as a scientist, because we know so much about it and I've studied it for so long, I know that humanity as a whole, some more than others, are definitely partly to blame for this. I know also that it's avoidable, and I think that's where the disappointment comes from, because it doesn't have to be this way.
So when we looked at that healthy reef and that sense of awe, that future is possible.
Yeah, and it's still there in many places. Yeah, but they're becoming more and more difficult to find.
So we've just introduced to classes watching this idea of an unhealthy reef, this idea of a healthy reef, and the influence of human activity between the two, and both that human activity can make a healthy reef unhealthy, but also the other way around.
Of course.
That's a reversible process. Renee, you touched on this your career in studying the reef, in searching out both healthy and unhealthy reefs and finding out what's going on. Can you sort of brief? I mean, I know you could do a whole live lesson about your career in coral science. Could you just sort of touch on maybe that first time that you started to investigate the reef, and also sort of what kinds of things you've been looking at over the years?
Yeah, of course. I'll try to condense it a bit. So I am originally from Curacao. So I've been around reefs for most of my life, though for most of the beginning of my life not as a scientist, obviously. And although I was always fascinated by the reefs as something that I liked very much, either to fish or to snorkel, to look at, I never started really thinking about reefs in a scientific point of view until I went to study, which was roughly about 15 years ago. I did biology in the Netherlands, and until since about probably 12 years, I really started to focusing on reef biology, to the point where at this point I'm a coral biologist. So I work with the coral animal itself, and what I do mostly is I look at the animal, because corals are animals, even though they don't look like the sort of classic animals. And I study the impact or the relationship between the organism, so the coral animal, and its environment. And sometimes I study how the environment and the coral can reinforce each other to do better. But naturally now, especially with climate change, I've also focused a lot on the negative impacts of a changing climate on how the coral is doing physically. So how does it affect their growth? How does it affect their survival? How does it affect their reproduction, etc. So that's sort of the overarching theme of my research now at the present.
And we've got some lovely words coming through from the healthy reef from classes watching. We've got amazed, captivated, curious, wonder, and you've talked about studying sort of the changes that the coral animals experiencing because of a changing climate. We've got some examples here in front of us of sort of coral skeletons.
Yeah.
What kinds of things are these corals undergoing with a changing climate? I mean, how is climate change affecting, I know that we don't have the living tissue on here, but what kind of things might a coral undergo?
Well, I could perhaps take a small step back and explain you what you're holding here, just for the people who haven't experienced it yet. So what I'm holding here is the skeleton of a small coral that's found on the reef here. And it's just a skeleton, so there's no animal on here anymore. This is just the dead part. And as I mentioned, corals are animals. They don't look like the animals that we see on land mostly, or even in the sea, like fishes and stuff, in that they have no well-defined body parts. It's basically the skeleton, so you could say just a rock covered with a very thin layer, probably about a couple of millimeters of tissue. And that layer slowly grows outwards and becomes larger by increasing the skeleton underneath it. So you can imagine that this ball becomes just bigger and bigger and bigger in size without really changing shape very much. It doesn't produce a head or legs or anything like that. It's stuck to the bottom, so it can't move. The only thing it can really do is react to its environment and grow faster or slower. These colonies could become really large over hundreds, if not thousands of years. They could become probably, you know, as large as a school bus. I've seen them in Australia.
Wow.
And the coral itself is a bit of a curious animal in that when you would look at a coral alone, you would often see that it is white. Now, when you see pictures, for example, of coral bleaching, what you're really looking at is actually just the animal. And what gives it a color is not the animal itself. That is a small algae that lives inside the tissue of the coral. And these algae have different pigments, we call them, which are essentially the different colors, and they give the coral its own color. So I've always thought it's a bit funny when we talk about coral bleaching, because, you know, we should be talking about coral coloring, because the coral is always bleached. It's a very thin, transparent layer of tissue over a white skeleton, and the tissue is so thin that you see the skeleton through it if it doesn't have these pigments.
Got it.
And then when the coral dies, obviously, the tissue will be broken down and all you're left with is a skeleton.
So, I mean, I don't know whether you've got 3 photographs of the stages of coral bleaching, I think from American Samoa, from the Seaview team. And so, if we looked at the first photograph, what we can see is a healthy reef, and that's these tiny animals on their skeleton, and they've got these sort of the vegetable algae cells inside them, which keeps them supercharged.
Yeah.
And then if the ocean becomes too warm, there's a breakdown in that relationship.
Absolutely.
What, I mean, is that just, you know, do we know what happens there?
Yeah. It's a rather technical story, and I won't go into too many details. But it's exactly as you describe it. There is this relationship between the animal and the algae, which give the coral its color. When you therefore look at a healthy coral, they always have a color of some sort. Many are brown, purple, you'll find red, yellow, blue, anything in between, really. And this relationship is obviously dependent on many things, as with all things in life. There are certain conditions under which it functions well, and there are certain conditions under which it doesn't. And one of the things that you indeed mentioned is temperature. This is a natural thing. This is not something that's only happening in the last couple of decades. Corals have always been bleaching when the temperature gets either too high or too low. It's a natural mechanism. It doesn't have to be necessarily bad. It gives the coral a chance to reset and adapt to different conditions. But now what we see with global warming is that the climate is warming up so fast that this bleaching will happen so frequently that the corals don't recover from it anymore. And then it does become a problem. So you have here a natural phenomenon that never really used to be a problem, and in many cases could help the coral to survive and adapt, is now becoming really problematic, to the point where we really think it's threatening the survival of the coral reefs worldwide.
I mean, I think Renee, just to sort of carry that story on. So that bleaching, that losing of the extra energy that the algae is giving to the coral animal, that's a starvation point.
It turns to that very quickly, yes, because the animal do provide the coral with a lot of energy for its daily, let's say, survival, its daily nutrition, whatever they eat on a daily basis. And that can be anywhere between 50 and perhaps up to 95%, which is a great deal. Then when the corals bleach and the algae are expelled from the tissue, that whole source of energy is dropped. And if that persists for very long, of course, the corals have plenty of reserves, so they can, they can last weeks, sometimes even, if they're very healthy corals, maybe 2 months. But eventually what will happen is they'll deplete all their energy reserves. They become more and more sort of starved all the time until they could die, yes.
I mean, this is of course sort of one of the. We've got words here: upset, worry, ashamed, sad. Looking at these,
Yeah.
unhealthy reefs. Renee, just before we move on to looking at some of the solutions and some of the factors that we need to make sure we have in place for a healthy reef, how do you feel your research fits into this, into this looking for, a better future for coral? What's the importance of science and what you've been doing here?
Well, I think science is sort of the staple in the whole process that really tells you what's going on. I think historically, at least, well, maybe not only historically, I think perhaps even now, a lot of people in power are really underestimating the importance of science because of the rigorous work, not just by me, but by scientists worldwide and all of them who've come before me, because we're just the latest tiny part in a very large field. I say we, but I think you know what I mean. It's everybody who is involved in the scientific world. By doing our experiments, by really coming up with new ideas and testing them rigorously, we have found out so much about how things work the way they do, what makes something work, what makes everything work. And the knowledge is only increasing, and that knowledge will not just tell you obviously how things work now or how they have worked in the past, but they can also give you a lot of information about what we can do to make things better. But you can only do that when you really understand something, because otherwise your predictions will not be accurate. So although my work is only a very small part in this whole thing, and I mean very small part, because I'm just one person, and there's thousands, tens, hundred thousands of people involved in this. All these little bits put together, given enough time, will give you all these beautiful scientific theories that we now have. And over time, these become established, and we will teach them in school, and then everybody can learn how these systems work.
And Renee, thank you so much, because I've always thought that all sciences, but especially environmental sciences, is like creating a jigsaw. Where each research team is working on their little bit, but that creates this overall picture to help our understanding. And we've come up with sort of like 4 areas with this live lesson for caring for coral. Hopefully we'll come to some things that young people can do wherever they are, not necessarily this, if they live near a coral reef. And the 4 areas that we are looking at, and I think this goes for being healthy whoever you are.
Yeah.
So that's having a stable environment, and you've got these sections on your student sheets. It is being safe from harm, and we'll cover these briefly in a bit. It's having lots of friends. And we'll look at interdependence and what we saw on the reef. And we've also got having your voice heard, or having a megaphone, having a loud voice. We've got some questions coming up, and I think that through this Q&A section, we'll be able to help students to start to fill in those different areas. And towards the end, we can start to think about what actions that we can take. We've covered a stable environment. Obviously, the temperature's super important, having a stable temperature for coral, and that's connected to the larger climate change issue, global heating issue. We've got then safe from harm. There's a lot of things that we put into the ocean that aren't great. Could you help our students to sort of, they probably have an understanding about plastics and some pollution.
Yeah.
Is that, wherever you are in the world, is that something that's going to affect the coral reef?
Yes, of course, of course. I mean, it's in a way silly to think that what happens in one country in terms of pollution will not affect a much larger area, perhaps even worldwide. Some of the things that we throw away as pollutants, such as plastic, you could think of CO2, the greenhouse gas, also as a pollutant. You can think of chemicals that are discharged from factories into rivers, rivers feed into oceans. So all of that connectivity brings these substances to many different places and has a great effect. What is bad for something that you wouldn't want to throw in your own yard, obviously you also wouldn't want to throw in the ocean or in any other system. There's many things that we know of for certain that affect coral reefs in a negative way. You mentioned plastics, you mentioned pollutants. We touched on temperature, which is, let's say, indirect CO2. Another thing, for example, could be nutrients, the sort of fertilizers that we use in agriculture. When those are washed out and end up in the sea, they can have very bad effects on coral reefs in their own ways. We can think about, for example, dredging out harbors, and the mud and the suspended material that gets pushed up into the water will smother the coral. So there's many things that we humans tend to like to do that are very bad for the environment.
And coming on to a sort of positive piece, if you're out on the reef here, you see there's a lot of fish around, and we talk about protecting coral, but perhaps we can talk about it's not just the coral animal that we're looking at. The coral needs some friends to help it out.
Absolutely, yeah. No, you're right, you're completely right. We talk about corals because naturally it's a coral reef and corals form the foundation of it. But I think I mentioned it already in the beginning of the talk. There's so many animals, and not just animals, there are also plants and the microbes. We always talk about microbes in a negative way. A lot of microbes are indeed harmful. For example, they can make you ill or they can vector diseases. But without microbes, the coral reef is also nothing. So when we talk about protecting the coral, what we really actually should be saying is protecting the ecosystem that is the coral reef, which includes obviously the shoreline, because everything starts from shore. You need to protect the shore, you need to protect the alleys that funnel water into the ocean, such as the gullies, the rivers, things like that. And of course, also to make sure that not all the coastline is being developed, because then you'll have the development harming the reef. So it starts above the water, and then underwater, you've got the fish. So something like no fishing zones could be a very wise idea. We need to protect other animals, so when you write legislation that shouldn't mention corals, because the algae, the sponges deserve the same kind of protection. It's a complete system. It's very fine-tuned together. So all the organisms play their own part in it. And think of it as perhaps a chain of events or a literal chain of things. It's no longer a chain when you take one of the links out. And that's very important to realize, because coral is obviously at the base of it, perhaps, but without any of the other partners, the fish, even the turtles, the shoreline, none of this would be able to function the way it does. So we need to really talk about protecting the whole system.
Brilliant. Thank you, Renee. And the last thing is just having a voice. You know, giving coral more of a voice and having its voice heard. I suppose it's down to the work of scientists, of conservationists, but also to you in the classroom is telling as many people about the wonderful coral reef as well. We're going to come on, and Renee's mentioned some of the sort of overarching sort of like issues, factors in terms of coral health, and do send in specific questions. You know, if you want to know sort of specifically, well, what is it that we can do at home about a certain topic, then do get that question to us. But there's some really wonderful questions come through, so I'm just going to start here. We've got Charlie at Colleton Grammar. Hi, Charlie. We've talked about all of this, about healthy, unhealthy reefs and everything else, but why is coral important? Why?
Well, actually, Charlie, that's a very good question. Let me give give me 1 second to formulate my answer. Okay, I'll answer it in 2 ways, but they'll be connected. I think you'll see what I mean. The one way is the fact that the world is the way it is because it's evolved to become this way. Everything in it, therefore, plays kind of an important role naturally, if you like, in that, you know, we didn't build this, it's there. When you look at it, you think, oh, you know, what's so important about it? Not counting the fact that a lot of people depend on it for livelihood, it's also something aesthetic. It's the world in which we live. Without it, the world would be somehow poorer, if you follow what I mean. There's a lot of things that we could lose. Say, for example, a beautiful mountain. If that would certainly to be disappearing, you wouldn't look at the landscape the same way, I don't think, without feeling perhaps even almost a sense of personal loss about something that you liked and enjoyed very much. So that's, I guess we could call it aesthetics in a way, something that is beautiful to look at, that no doubt plays an important natural role in, for example, shaping the coastline. Because it does shape the coastline, it shapes the vegetation and the landscape behind the coastline, which in turn has an effect on all these different environments around that, bit of like a butterfly effect. And then there's obviously the economic value, which I don't like to talk about because I think it's less important than the natural value. But for some people, it is an important thing nonetheless. I think the latest estimates are that there's almost 1 billion people globally who, so 1/8 almost of the world population depend on coral reefs, either directly or indirectly for their livelihoods. I have no idea about the figures, but it's got to be somewhere in the billions or trillions of dollars that it provides in annual revenue to local economies. If that were to disappear, you're going to take such a big chunk out of all these environments, all these, what would you call them, societies almost, that's not going to be replaced very easily with other means of income, of food, of livelihood, of safety. And that would be the additional loss as well. Perhaps because I think it is an important question, so maybe I'll just make one more comparison because it is so important. For me, the equivalence of it would be to lose like a culture or an entire language. You know, for me, the world wouldn't be the same without it. If suddenly the English language were to disappear, whether you speak English or not, I think everybody worldwide would be poorer for it because you have lost a potential of learning something about a language or about a culture that is going to be lost forever. And I think that's yeah, I wouldn't say unacceptable, but it is tremendously sad.
I'm almost taking a moment, Renee. It's a very, very moving description of the importance of the reef and that its loss would diminish us all, and not just in terms of livelihood, but in the essence of being a human on this planet.
Human, exactly. And of course, it's much worse for the people who directly depend on it. But I would argue, and I think there's a good case to be made for it, that it affects even people who have never seen it, people who would perhaps never see it, because it takes away the opportunity of you to once learn about it and enjoy it as we have in the past. And you won't get that back, and the sort of irreversibility of it is something I think we need to be very careful about.
We'll make sure that we've got 10 minutes left. We'll make sure that we spend
Yes.
the last 5 minutes talking about positive
Things,
positive
absolutely.
Things. But there's some sort of a few questions we'll probably sort of not get them through quickly, but sort of like, you know, look at the sort of top points. Alex would like to know, do different species of coral use different methods for survival? I mean, is there different levels of resilience? Is that something that we can look at with a bit of hope?
Yeah, no, absolutely. not all corals are the same. There are some corals that are notoriously sensitive to all kinds of stress, and there are corals who are really incredibly resilient, and you'll find them almost growing everywhere. There's a lot of research at the moment, not by me personally, but of a lot of colleagues that I know, that's focused on studying these more, let's say, hardy corals, the ones that can tolerate a lot. They are making great progress in finding out what the things are that allow these corals to be so resistant. They are trying to, it's a bit of a heavy term, but they call it assisted evolution, where they try to focus on these traits that make them so hardy and try to sort of, breed them a bit stronger in other species of corals. So there's a lot of work being done in trying to get the corals that we have to become more resistant to all these stresses that we mentioned. And they're having some great luck too. So there's a lot of great potential coming out of that work.
Renee, there's a couple of questions that we've touched on already, but I'm just going to acknowledge them.
Yes.
So that's Strasta asking what would happen if there were no corals left in the sea. We've talked about the impact on coastlines, on economies, and also the diminishing of our natural world and that impact on our humanity. And then Lucy was asking about coral bleaching and how that works, and also how that affects the sort of all the life that relies on the reef. And I think Lucy, you probably saw both in the photographs from American Samoa and the video from around here, that when you see imagery of healthy reefs, you see a lot more surrounding life, and then unhealthy reefs will be less of that surrounding life. The really interesting question here is from Esther, and I know there's work happening here on Curacao in terms of artificial reefs and reef restoration. How effective is that sort of artificial reef and restoration work at bringing back the coral reef? And I suppose a follow-up from me is, does that need to go hand in hand with a wider work?
Yes. Reef restoration is a very important tool that we have increasingly at our disposal now to let's say reseed, almost like you would reseed a forest, new patches of reefs. We can do that, for example, with the resilient corals that we talked about in the previous question. So we can select for corals that will do better. But of course, all of this would be meaningless if we don't tackle the source. It's a bit like trying to dry your house when the tap is still running. We need to work on both sides. There's great work being done on both of these topics. We're making more and more progress faster and faster. That is a trend that needs to continue to happen. I would argue that it needs to be accelerated. I'm very happy with some of the current progress we're making. I'm very positive about it. But as we saw, there's two clocks ticking. There's the clock ticking that sort of like, if you like, the timeline of reef degradation worldwide. And then there's the other clock ticking where we are trying to make a difference and trying to make things better again. At the moment, the clock of degradation is still ticking faster. We have some catching up to do, and we are making good work. Again, I say we, but you know what I mean, right? It's everybody who's involved in this, not just scientists, but also policymakers, management, people at home who are just genuinely concerned. We are all making very great progress. So that clock of recovery or what's the word we used earlier? I like that word better. Restoration, exactly. Yeah, that is ticking faster and faster, but it's got some catching up to do, and we need to accelerate that process along. And that's where everybody who is watching can play a great role. I want to very quickly, if I can, do we have any important questions? Otherwise, I would like to come back to the emotions we heard earlier.
Come back to the emotions. We've got
okay.
An action point.
Yes.
We'll sort of finish on. We've got 4 minutes on both government and personal action.
Yeah.
But please do come back to the emotion.
Yeah. I think that's an important and often overlooked thing, because people don't really like to talk about emotions and these kind of things.
British, we don't.
You don't, you never. Yeah. And there's a bit of perhaps a misconception that I've seen every now and then, where people say that negative emotions are by definition bad emotions. So say, for example, emotions such as anger or disappointment or frustration.
Upset, worried, ashamed, and sad.
Yeah. I mean, I would consider those negative emotions because they're not nice emotions to have, but I think they're important emotions to have if they are used in the right way, because obviously a lot of people sit at home and they see how terrible certain things are, and they get in a way, they get paralyzed, and they feel powerless to do anything about it. And I want to contest that a bit, because I wake up most of my mornings very angry when I read, when I put the news on and I see what's happened, and I think, oh man, they're really doing it again. But if you could take that frustration and that anger and funnel it into something positive, it's a great motivator to get up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm so upset with this, I'm gonna do something about it. I'm gonna put some pressure on certain people that I know can make an influence. I wanna talk to kids at home or at school. I'll say yes to giving an interview, to give publicity, and that motivation comes indirect, obviously, from negative emotions such as anger and disappointment on the one hand, and the awe and the amazement and the wonder on the other hand, because it's just on the one hand so sad to see it disappear, but at the same time, when you can make a difference, it doesn't have to, and that motivation gets me through the day.
Incredibly important to be able to look at flipping that into action and acknowledging those emotions. And I suppose those emotions also are driven by the fact of how wonderful it can be. We're going to close, and we've got about a minute here. Would it be, let's think about some things that's really easy for schools to do in sort of Northern Europe or America. Can we ask students to have at least one completely vegetarian day at each of their schools to bring down emissions? Would that be a start?
Of course, yeah. Everything is a start. Not only are vegetarian meals, if they're made well, obviously, very nice to have. Meat, as you know, is a great source of carbon pollution, and all limitations on it, even how small ever they are good things in their own way. Yes.
So we can think about that. Think about how you travel to school.
Yep. Take the bike if you can. Public transport is great ways. Even if you don't have access to either, perhaps carpooling to have fewer cars on the road. All of these make a difference.
On the Encounter EDU website, there's huge amounts of resources about reducing plastic waste as well. So do check those out. We talked a little bit about government action. So COP26 is happening at the moment. Have a look at the news with your teachers. Look at how you can write to your MP about putting further pressure on the government. And Renee mentioned something called no-take zones or marine protected areas earlier. It will surprise you, for all those watching in the UK, that the UK has the power to make some quite significant no-take zones for coral reefs around the world. So further pressure there. Is there anything else? Tell everybody.
Yeah. Well, I think since I only have a very little bit of time left, I think what you would perhaps look to do is make the people who are in charge and are making decisions, make them feel as uncomfortable as you are. Not by harassing them, at their homes, but ask them difficult questions, which they can't answer, and everybody will see that. To put a bit of pressure on those people, perhaps with school or with your parents, all these small changes, if you multiply those by a lot of people around the world, can make such a big difference. And then if everybody does a little bit, it means that not one person or one country has to do a lot. And then the impacts on everybody's own individual lives can be very small, and you might not even notice it very much. And then they are very manageable.
Renee, as always, inspiring, thought-provoking, a little bit tear-jerking, if I may say so. But thank you so much for sharing your insights, your thoughts, your meditations on the future of the reef. And just to remind everyone watching is that the future of the wonderful coral reef is unwritten, and it's up to all of us to write a wonderful next chapter. Thank you so much for being part of AXA Coral Live, and for now it's goodbye from Curacao and goodbye from us. Bye bye.
My pleasure. Goodbye.